Thank you, Tamar, and welcome to everyone who are joining us here, either for the first time or as part of the series. Whether Christian jokes are as funny, that's an interesting question, and I think we'll try to answer that today because we will really see the difference in genre, and we'll talk a little bit about that because we started asking that question last week. A few comments before we begin. I hate talking to myself. It feels very lonely. So when you guys ask questions while I talk so I can answer at the end, it makes it feel more of a dialogue. I like that you also make comments on my humor, and this is it feels closer to you. So please feel free to do so. Also, again, each lecture stands on its own, but you can choose to either see all three or one at a time. And speaking of comments, at the end of today's class, I wrote down one of the comments as one of you wrote down, and I want to actually reference it because I thought it was a very good comment. So we'll get back to that at the end. So what are we doing today? So today I basically want to do the flip side of humor in early first century CE, because we kept asking about humor and satire and mockery, and we talked about humor in general in rabbinic literature, and then we turned our gaze towards humor and the use of humor and mockery and satire and polemics. And I'm using all these words because we kind of mentioned already that it's hard to say when one ends and one begin, and there's a lot of mythological question, but here we're here for the big picture. When you mock someone else, when you make fun of, or when you mock yourself, or when you use humor to tackle difficult questions. How does it look when you do it in relation to serious matters, such as theology, such as, and our topic for today, Jewish-Christian interaction, or at large, interreligious dialogue? When two religious groups live side by side, know about each other's views, and they try to address those differences between them, the similarities between them, the anxieties that each produce. How does humor play into that? So I kind of spent last week talking about one story in the Talmud where a conversation between a heretic, a min, and a rabbinic figure is revealed to basically represent reactions of rabbinic authors to contemporaneous Christians' views through humor, through parody, through jokes. And we tried to uncover the ways in which it was done. I ended with a bunch of questions, which I want to go back to at the end of today's lecture, about who wrote this genre of literature, who understood it in real time, who decided this was worth keeping, and how are we as the future audience are meant to look at this, and what can we learn about the historical circumstances that created these stories? So these are a bunch of questions, but we did this, the first two lectures focused on rabbinic literature. Today's lecture focuses on the other side, on what does the Christian literature say about the Jews. And actually, I want to start not with a Christian text. I want to start with a Christian text quoting a Greco-Roman pagan writer. So today we start with a text that's called the Epistle of Mediator to Diognetus. And now this is in translation to English. This is the letter of the friend of the student to Diognetus. Who are those people? Who is the friend who's writing the letter? Who is this Diognetus? We don't know. People think scholars think that this was written around the late 2nd century CE. But most importantly, this letter, it was written in Greek, and we're going to not read it in Greek, don't worry, we're going to read it in English. But the writer and the audience are unknown. We don't know who wrote this and to whom. We do know that this letter is part of the early example of what we call apologetic writing. These apologetic writings defend Christianity from its accusers. So in the first, few centuries CE, especially in the 2nd century when Christianity was brand new, it needed to defend itself. against Greco-Roman writers, what we call pagan, maybe against Jews as well, and attacks on this new religion that came and was created and was very popular, very fast in the 2nd century, but was very heavily under attack. So we have writings from that time period, which are called apologetic writing, defending Christianity. One of those letters is this one. And before we get to the pagan writer, I want to read this. So this epistle basically talks about Jews. And this letter writer talks to the other guy and he says the following. I imagine that you are most desirous of hearing something on this point. What's the point? So he's going to address a serious point. What's the point? That the Christians do not observe the same form of divine worship as do the Jews. So the question at hand is this. If Jews and Christians, have shared roots, come from very similar things, both rely on the Old Testament, on the Bible, how come, at the end of the day, they don't keep the same thing? And he says the following. And now he's going to list a list, which is a very, very important list. I won't have time to go into the history of it and how often this list appears. But you know what? Let's stop here for a second. If I had to make you stop for a second and think of what makes a Jew today in the 21st century, what makes a Jew? And now let's read a list that was written in the 2nd century CE and see what the differences are. So let's see. But as to their scrupulosity concerning meats and their superstition as respect to the Shabbat, and their boasting about circumcision, and their fancies about fasting, and the new moons, which are utterly ridiculous and unworthy of notice. I do not think that you're required to learn anything from me. So he makes a list of 5 things that Jews keep and Christians don't. So, by the way, a very, very important text and a very important list to start talking about the separation between Jews and Christians in the 1st century CE. Because if we're looking at the separation between Jews and Christians, according to this text, in the 2nd century, someone knew very exactly to pinpoint what's the difference between Jews and Christians in terms of praxis. There's 5 things that Jews do that Christians don't. By the way, it started off, and I kind of cut off part about sacrifices, but put sacrificing aside. This is the 5 things. What are the things? We have scrupulosity concerning meats. Jews keep meats. They keep kosher, right? Some kind of forms of something that has to do with dietary needs. So this is one. Second, Shabbat. They keep Shabbat. They keep the 7th day of the week. And circumcision. This is something that the Jews do. And fasting. Jews fast. That's a thing that the Jews do. By the way, we need to think about it's not just Yom Kippur and the fast, but also we have evidence from early on that Jews were used to fast twice a week. But fasting in general, that's a thing that the Jews used to do. And new moons, which refers to lunar calendar as opposed to solar calendar, which some authors, so the Greco-Romans and the Christian at this point are keeping solar calendars. So the Jews do these 5 things. Now notice, by the way, that alongside the list, there is a description of each of the thing in the list, right? We have superstition, and we have scrupulosity, and we have boasting, which is an interesting word to say. Jews are vain and boasting about which of the 5? About circumcision, which is extremely interesting. You have to imagine the ancient world, Greco-Roman world, taking one's foreskins off and being boastful about it, being proud of it. This is something that is, weird to people who, circumcision was one of the big one that is let go when non-Jews joined the Christian church, because this would have been very hard to pass to non-Jews, because circumcision harming your own body and, making it less than it was when you were born. And the Jews take this and turn it on its head, and they're boastful on it, right? We'll see this again. And lastly, you see fancies about fasting and new moon. So he's mocking them. And here we join a little bit our topic, right? So he's taking the 5 things that Jews do and Christians don't. By the way, let's stop here for a second. Remember my exercise? When you were thinking what makes a Jew, I don't think our list is so much different. An Orthodox Jew that keep commandments, that list is not very far from what makes a Jew in general, as opposed to non-Jews. So this list is a very interesting list, and by the way, it repeats itself in a few writings in the first century CE, so we know that it goes back very early on as being what makes a Jew a Jew. By the way, I spend a lot of time in my classes showing that this list that supposedly present what the Jew do and a Christian doesn't really represent what's happening on the ground. We can find Christian being circumcised, we can find Christian, keeping kosher, some kind of kosher laws, the seventh day, even kosher laws, as I said, and fasting as well. Not going to go into that, and definitely lunar calendar, especially when it comes to Easter. I'm just laying it out there. My new book that's about to come out will survey all that. Just a plug for my new book. But all of this is basically a list that's not really representing of all of Jewish community and all of Christian communities in the first century and the differences between them. But going back to our writer, according to this writer, this is the difference between Jews and Christian. There's a bunch of stuff that Jews do and Christian don't. And look how he phrased each one of them. He makes fun of this, right? What they believe is funny. It's ridiculous. It's not worth engaging with. He mocks them, right? He takes it and in a second we'll see how he mocks it. But this is how we start the conversation. It's a conversation that degrades and shames whatever the Jews are doing. By the way, I love this because he says, it's not worth talking about. And then what he'll do, obviously, for the rest of the time, is talk about this. Now, what is he going to say about those 5 things? And he says the following. 4, to accept some of those things which have been formed by God for the use of men as properly formed, and to reject others as useless and redundant, how can this be lawful? What is he talking about? He's talking about the first of the list, right? Which is kosher laws. And he says, how is it possible to read Leviticus, the list of animals that we can eat versus the list of animals we can't eat? Look at this list and say, yeah, some of the animals are good and some are not good, right? We can't eat, an alligator, but we can eat a cow. Right? How is this even logical? Right? It's not lawful. How can that be that we read this literally in Leviticus? So this is totally insane, right? It doesn't make any sense. He makes fun of it. Okay. And to speak falsely of God as if he forbade us to do what is good on the Sabbath day, how is it not impious? Well, we're supposed to keep the Sabbath, right? That's the second thing on the list. But according to this, how is keeping the Sabbath, and for example, not breaking the Sabbath to save a life of someone? By the way, we live in a world where saving someone's life actually trumps Shabbat. But in these times, in Second Temple period, that was not always the case. There was a big discussion, even within rabbinic circles, when can you break the Sabbath and when you can't. But this is a direct reference to Jesus in the New Testament that talks about healing on the Sabbath, someone from leprosy, or plucking wheat and eating it on the Sabbath, even though you're not supposed to do that on the Sabbath. And Jesus talks about someone being hungry and giving him something to eat on the Sabbath, or healing on the Sabbath. And they're like, how is this lawful? That the Sabbath trumps everything according to rabbinic law. Next one, and to glory in the circumcision of the flesh as a proof of election, and is a fifth, on account of it, they were specially beloved of God. How is it not a subject of ridicule? And again, here he talks about number 3, circumcision. And again, to glory in the circumcision, we get a glimpse of the Jews' claim in 2nd century CE. By the way, we see that in rabbinic literature as well, that circumcision is a sign of election. They glory in it. And he's like, how is this possible? You just circumcise your flesh. How do you see that as a sign of election, right? He's making fun of what the Jews mark as a sign of election, right? He's like, this doesn't make any sense. And as for their observing months and days, as if waiting upon the stars and the moon and their distribution according to their own tendency, the appointments of God and the vicissitudes of the season, some for festivities and others for mourning. Who would deem this a part of divine worship and not much rather manifestation of folly? What is he talking about now? This is the last one. This is the lunar calendar. He's like, seriously? We have to like wait and see if we see a sliver of the moon, and then, we have to like, define that this is the beginning, or declare a beginning of a new month, and like everyone is waiting to see if the moon appears and blah, blah, blah. He's like, how is this even logical? How is this divine worship to wait until we see the moon and whatever? This doesn't make any sense, he says, right? He's making fun of those 5 things that make a Jew, right? All the things that define a Jew, he mocks and walks God, and he laughs at it as being illogical, a folly, right? This is funny. And by the way, and then he finishes, I suppose then that you are sufficiently convinced that the Christians properly abstain from the vanity, again, vanity, notice, an error common to both Jews and Gentiles, and from the busybody spirit and vain boasting of the Jews. Again, we have the boasting element here. So he finishes by saying, I mocked all of this. This doesn't make any sense. Nothing that the Jews do make any sense. So this is our intro to Christians mocking Jewish praxis, right? They make fun of Jewish practice by going through one by one the list of stuff that Jews do, the Christian don't, and they look at it and they ask, is this logical? Is it not a folly, right? They look for the logic, the sense of it in the theology of the Jews, and they mock one by one and basically show that this is not something worth following or doing. So this is where we start in the 2nd century CE, and I think this is a good point to stop and say, when the Jews make fun of the Christian, like we saw in the 4th, 5th, 6th century in the Babylonian Talmud, and they mock and they polemicize it in Christian beliefs, and we saw a few examples, this is part of a conversation, a dialogue, right, between Christian mocking Jews and Jews mocking Christians. And again, as I mentioned before in the beginning of my talk, we will in a second bring even a Greco-Roman writer mocking Jews or mocking Christians. Everyone's mocking everyone in the ancient world. Polemics is part of Christian writing and Christian theology, Christian beliefs. This is something that's very much part and parcel of theology in the ancient world, and especially from the side of the Christian, because this is apologetic writing. They have to defend the way they practice, their new religion, the way they practice the true Israel, the true religion of Israel, and they have to defend it. And they do it as part of it, they mock, right? They take and they make fun of whatever the other group are doing. Let's do some more. And this is where, again, I want to bring into the picture of the interreligious dialogue of the 1st century CE and how people treat each other, and bring a text actually written by a pagan, or a Greco-Roman writer. We don't have its writing. They're gone. They're dead. They didn't survive. But we are very lucky, because this guy on your picture, this is Origen, that lived in the 3rd century, a church father. He wrote a book polemicizing against the Greco-Romans, right? So and by doing so, he quotes a guy named Celsus. He was a Greek philosopher, and he wrote in the second half of the 2nd century, and he wrote a book called The True World, around 177 CE. And he's a Greco-Roman writer, and he attacks Christianity very severely. Now, Origen in the 3rd century, combat his accusation, right? And he fights against him, whatever. But by doing so, he quotes, right? So he quotes Celsus and then answers. And he quotes and answers. And then what happens in history is that the original work, The True World, is lost. We don't have it. But because of Origen fighting him, now we have it. So obviously one of the dangers of polemicizing against someone, it's always a question, right? When someone attacks you, do you react and basically, give it publicity and answer and then give it a lot of like noise, or do you just keep quiet and then it just disappears? So Origen didn't keep quiet, he answers, and by this actually preserved posterity the text that would have been lost otherwise. So this is the text, and why I'm bringing it, because I want to bring an attack or a mockery of this guy Celsus against the Jews and the Christian, right? So in the 2nd century CE, so in the 3rd century CE, Origen, the church father, quotes Celsus who writes in the 2nd century a mockery of both Jews and Christians. And this is what he writes. In the next place, ridiculing after his usual style the race of Jews and Christians, right? So he's like, Celsus likes to ridicule us, right? He makes fun of us. And let me quote what he makes fun of us, right? That's his manner. And he says the following. So now we're going to read, and this is everything in quotation, is a quote from the True Word, right? Written in 177 by a Greco-Roman writer, Celsus. And he's going to quote him and then answer, right? He being Origen. So he quotes Celsus, and that's what he says. He compares the Jews and Christians to a flight of bats or to a swarm of ants issuing out of their nest, or to frogs holding council in a march, or to worms crawling together in the corner of a dunghill, and quarreling with one another as to which of them were the greater sinners, and asserting that God chose and announced it to all things beforehand. What is he making fun of here? He's taking the shared belief by both Jews and Christians, that God sees them, that God looks at them, that God judges them, that God announces what was before and what was the world. What we call hashgacha pratit, individual observance of God of each individual. And he looks at them, this Greco-Roman writer, and he says, both the Jews and Christian, they're likened to, and it's meant to be funny, it's meant to be grotesque. He's like, they're like bats, or ants, or frogs holding council in a march. You should think of insignificant little creatures that sits in groups in a march, or in a swarm of ants, or a flight of bats, and they're like discussing among themselves, these little insignificant creatures think that a God, if it exists, and he thinks it exists, but this God has nothing better to do than to look at and observe what each ant does and think, right? He's like, you are ridiculous. And it's meant to be funny. It's meant to degrade and make fun of this belief of a personal observant by a God. And that, abandoning the whole world and the region of heaven and this great earth, he became a citizen among us alone, right? And now he makes fun of the Christian. He's like, seriously? And God left everything and went down to earth to talk to humans, and to us alone makes an intimation, right? God tells us what he wants. He talks to Moses. He really left his realm in the world and just came to talk to us, to Moses, to prophets, and does not cease sending and inquiring in what way he might be associated with him forever. And he keeps sending us messengers, and he talks to us and communicates with us. He's the God of all, and you are ants and frogs and small insignificant creatures. And you really imagine a God that cares about what you want and what you think enough to keep communicating with you? So this is meant to be a mockery of both Christians and Jews. By the way, using very, naturalistic imagery, right? You're supposed to think of, when there's crumbs on the floor and all the ants come crawling and the frogs in a march or whatever. It's meant to be grotesque. It's meant to be inconceivable. It's meant to be really taking it to an extreme. The idea that God would care about humans to such a level to send prophets, to talk to them, to punish each of them, to pay attention to them when he is God. The Greco-Roman writer Celsus thinks this is completely absurd. And he makes fun of this, right? He takes a very serious theological belief by both Jews and Christians and mocks it. And he mocks it by using an imagery from nature, right? He compares humans to ants. And by doing so, he's making you read and say, wow, this is you know what? Thinking about it, it's not such an easy claim to have. Now, let's stop here for a second and talk about this mockery, right? First of all, this is part of what I've been trying to say, that the mockery of another religious group is not always a dialogue, right? We have to think of the ancient world as a world that has many religious groups. And in this case, we have a third one. This is not a two-way dialogue. This is a triangle of a dialogue. We have a third element, which is a Greco-Roman writer looking at Jews and Christians together and seeing what's common between them, and very different from his Greek belief. And he looks at the Jews and the Christians, and he identify what's shared, a shared belief between them, which is the belief that God cares and God pays attention to humans. And he looks at it from a side and he says, this is ridiculous. But again, this is a triangle where we have a pagan writer looking at Jews and Christians and mocks them to something that is shared, right? So the conversation is, and again, I go into this in detail in my book and in my classes, that in fact, the conversation in the ancient world is manifold, right? So there's many groups that are arguing. So Christians make fun of pagans, and pagans make fun of Jews, and Jews make fun of pagans, and Christians make fun of Jews, Jews make fun of Christians. We have all kinds of combination of this, and we can actually find shared threads in genre and style. But in this case, I wanted to bring the use of humor into that conversation, right? So it's not just polemics, and it's not just mockery, and sorry, it is mockery, that's what I want to point out, but it's not just rejecting a belief. It's not just putting aside something that some people believe in and saying, no, you were completely wrong. It's not just about a theological belief. It's the use of mockery. It's the use of humor to put down those two other religions. And again, the use of imagery from nature, right? Ants or frogs. I really, holding cancel in a march. Look at the language, right? It's meant to ridicule in a way that, makes you think of a talking toad, right? Or something like that, or a talking ant. This is kind of like a Disney movie. That's what you're supposed to think. And this imagery takes the humor to another level. And this is a vessel, a tool, in the inter-religious dialogue and polemics, right? You're mocking the others using humor to basically put them down. So again, we bring into the fore not just Christians against Jews or Jews against Christians or rabbis against, but also a third element, which is a Greco-Roman writer mocking Jews and Christians. Okay, let's do some more. Here we get to my favorite writer of all times, which is John Chrysostom. Seriously, my most favorite writer of the ancient times. He was an archbishop of Constantinople. His name, Chrysostom, is because it's actually a nickname. It's in Greek, it's a golden mouth, right? Why? Because he was very eloquent in preaching and public speaking. He was a very good speaker. I agree, by the way. We'll read in a second. He has a charm, he's funny, he mocks. And we'll read what he was doing. And he was, by the way, he lived in the 4th century, in the second half of the 4th century CE, to Greco-Syrian parents who were very rich. And because we know he was educated under a very famous Libanius pagan teacher, who was very good in rhetoric and in Greek language and literature, you can actually see how good he is at what he does. And this is what Chrysostom has to say. So Chrysostom is telling us that he is, again, he's talking to his Christian audience. And he's standing in front of his church goers. They're all Christians, card member holding Christians. And he talks to his audience. And we have a record of what he says in his church when he talks to his audience. And these bunch of sermons that he gives are brought together. They're recorded in a text called the Versus Judaeos against those who are Judaizing. This is not against the Jews, those who are Judaizing. And what does he mean? Let's read what he says. You need to imagine him standing in his pulpit in front of his church and all his listeners, and he says the following. Another very serious illness calls for any cure my words can bring. What's the serious illness, right? This is a cure, but very serious illness. What does he say? An illness which has become implanted in the body of the church. We must first root the ailment out and take out thought matters outside. We must first cure our own and then be concerned for others who are strange. And what is this disease? The festivals of the pitiful and miserable Jews are soon to march upon us one after the other and in quick succession. The Feast of the Trumpets, the Feast of the Tabernacle, and the fasts. So here stands a very serious church father in front of his church, and it's full of, is full of his audience, and he stands in front of them and he says, we have a very serious issue here, very, very serious, and I can't ignore it. And I have to be focused on it, and I have to think about it, and I have to address it, and I have to treat it because it's a serious illness. And what's this illness? Again, it's in a church, in front of his church Christian goers. What's the illness? The festivals of the Jews. Notice how he calls the Jews pitiful and miserable Jews. And what's the problem is, and by the way, I love this phrase, are soon to march upon us one after the other. Everyone who tried to keep the Jewish holidays know that in the beginning of, in the middle of Elul, before Tishrei, you're dreading the holidays that are soon to march one upon us, right? Everyone, one after the other. We actually have a lot of mockery in the ancient world for the Jews who have so many holidays, one after the other, right? So this is how it's called. I love the phrasing of it. And look at, he mentioned the holidays. What are the holidays? The Feast of the Trumpets, right? The Shofar, this is Rosh Hashanah. The Feast of the Tabernacles, Booth, right? Sukkot. And the fasts. We're talking about Yom Kippur, obviously, but notice the plural here. We'll stop here for a second. We don't have time to go into that. But again, fasts of the Jews. And why are the holidays of the Jews a problem for Chrysostom and his audience? Right? So what's the problem of Chrysostom when he's talking about the holiday, the Jewish holidays? And he says the following: there are many in our ranks who say they think as we do. Okay? So we have here, he's addressing a group of Christians from his audience who say they think as we do. They identify with as being Christian. They say they agree with us, but yet some of these are going to watch the festivals, and others will join the Jews in keeping their feasts and observing their fasts. So 4th century, right, Christian community of Chrysostom, there are people who call themselves Christians, but they watch the festivals, right? They see the Jews in their festivity. They go to synagogue. They listen to the trumpets. And some of them will join the Jews in keeping their feasts. They celebrate the feasts. They celebrate Rosh Hashanah. They celebrate the Sukkot. They observe their fasts. We have Christians from his community who are fasting on Yom Kippur. By the way, on the side, I'll tell you, this is an example of what I tried to say, that even though a 2nd century text tried to say, only the Jews keep lunar calendar, only the Jews keep the fast, whatever. Here, for example, we have an example of a Christian community where the head of, the church father standing in front of his community and saying, you guys are fasting on Yom Kippur. This is wrong. This is a problem. This is an ailment that I have to deal with. This is so problematic and traumatic that I have to dedicate this speech to uproot this, blah, blah, blah. But I thought only the Jews keep the fast. Well, not in 4th century community of Chrysostom. And he says the following: I wish to drive this perverse custom from the church right now. But now that the Jewish festivals are close by and at the very door, like we should imagine them, the speech being given in September, early Elul, and it's about to happen, so just before that, if I should fail to cure those who sick with Judaizing disease, I am afraid that because of their ill-suited association and deep ignorance, some Christians might partake in the Jews' transgression. Once they have done so, I fear my homilies on this transgression will be in vain. For if they hear no word from me today, they will join the Jews in their fast, and once they have committed the sin, it would be useless for me to apply the remedy. So Chrysostom is outraged, right? He's so angry. He's like, these people go and do with the Jews what they're not supposed to do. So first of all, as a historian, this text is extremely important, right? We learned that Jews and Christians were in such close proximity, and that Judaism was such an attraction for Christian audiences or Christian community that Chrysostom is talking to, that they actually practiced Jewish practices in the 4th century CE. And it's such a major issue that Chrysostom need to talk about this, right? So he's very, very upset. He's like, I need to stop you before it happens, blah, blah. Why? And this is where I want to talk about polemics again. But the Jews have not the finest idea of such things, living for their stomachs, all agape about the present, no better off than pigs and goats, ruled only by licentiousness and excessive gluttony. One thing only they know, how to stuff themselves and get drunk, and to come to blows over dancers, and get beat up in brawls over chariot drivers. I love this text, seriously. So he says, listen, you get a glimpse of life in the 4th century CE in this community. He says, listen, you can't go with the Jews. They don't know theology. Their customs, what they do, the holidays and everything, this is not the right way to go. Why? Because Jews are gluttonous. They care so much about food all the time. Right? He's like, they care so much about food. They're like pigs and goats. And again, licentiousness, they're very sexual, right? So this is, and by the way, I show this again and again in text when we talk about polemics and mockery. You mock the other for, there's things that you do, sexual and gluttony repeats again and again, and stupidity. So in this case, again, excessive gluttony and licentiousness. This is the two things that are very prevalent in those texts. And he says, the only thing they know is to stuff themselves. Look at the reality, the realistic sound behind it. How to stuff themselves and get drunk, to come to blows over dancers, and to get beat up in brawls over chariot drivers. So now, this is where I wanted to talk about mockery a little, right? So you get a sense of where the Jews are. They're this riffraff that sits in, bars or pubs, and they get drunk, and they come to blows over dancer. I'm guessing women dancers, right? And they fight over women. This is again the sexual aspect of it. And they get beat up in brawls over chariot drivers, right? They gamble, and then they go and they fight over it. So you get a sense of why you shouldn't join the Jews, because they're like the lower social economic strata. We don't want to hang with them. They don't know what's right. They don't know where God is. They don't know how to practice real theological spirituality, right? So you go to that direction of mocking and degrading and humiliating. In this case, by the way, again, I love the description. It's a very realistic, I'm guessing, description. Let me guess, not just of the Jews, of men in general in that time period. But again, this is a way to basically degrade the Jews and use mockery and humor to take down their beliefs and put it down. So far so good. We've done some texts, and I kind of looked at some. We did 2nd century, we did 3rd century Christian writer quoting a pagan, mocking Jews and Christians. We did John Chrysostom in the 4th century. And basically what I want to talk about is kind of summarize what we talked and use this a moment to talk about the text we read today, but also reflect on the text we read in Jewish texts as well. And kind of like take a step back and look at humor in interreligious dialogue and how do Jews and Christians look at each other. We talked about who wrote this mockery and jokes. And we kind of stopped while talking about polemics, right? We're talking about people writing this to polemicize, to degrade, to put down the other groups. All that is right. We also talked about the knowledge that person had to have, right? So who are those people, right? So we have church fathers, and in the rabbinic side, we have the rabbis or the editors of the rabbis, and we have people. But what does it say about them that they use mockery and jokes to talk about the other groups? This is something that we talked about. We also talked about the intended audience. Who's supposed to read this, right? Who's hearing this? So in the case of Chrysostom, we know that this is his churchgoers, but someone recorded it, right? So we in 2024, in a Beit Avichai lecture, read what Chrysostom wrote and spoke in his church, right? So we sit here and we listen to this because someone recorded it. So who's the intended audience? The people in his audience, us, in years to come. And how much did this intended audience needed to know to understand jokes, right? So when he's talking to an audience that goes and keep Yom Kippur, when he's talking to an audience and defining in the 2nd century what Jews do his audience need to know a Jew to understand what he's talking about? Do they need to know exactly what Jews do in their synagogue to talk about this? Or more importantly, when we talk about rabbinic literature and the jokes that are found in the Talmud, they're often hidden, right? And they're kind of like veiled, and they're humor, concealed humor. Was it obvious to his audience? Did everyone understand it? Was it a Saturday Night Live joke that everyone got, Yehudim Baim or Eretz Nehederet in Israel, that everyone gets the joke? Or was it something very local, that just the rabbis, very, very elite, I don't know, kind of like Jane Austen, Mr. Darcy mumbling under his mouth and only the sister of that guy sitting next to him gets the joke and that's enough? Is it a very highbrow humor, or very highbrow, only few people who knew about Christianity understand that, and the joke is intended for them? You understand that there's a difference in the history that I construct if the answer is different. How many people knew about Christianity in the rabbinic world? How many people in the Christian world knew about the Jews? Are we talking a lot? Are we talking a little? Is it intended for a very specific audience or more? These are all questions that sometimes can be answered, in the service of Chrysostom, more fully, and in the case of the rabbis, less fully. I don't know who the intended audience and how many people knew. How was the mockery understood through the centuries? How did it feel to read a text such as this today? How does it feel to read the text after the Crusades, where Jews were actually killed because of this kind of polemics? How does mockery read to us now? How does mockery, when I have to teach my text, I was on sabbatical, I taught this text to non-Jewish audiences. When I read the Talmud mocking, to Christian audiences, when I read the Talmud mocking Jesus, like we did last week, how was this mockery understood and what influence did it have on Jewish or Christian history, on the interreligious dialogue between groups? How does it feel? How does it feel to read this today when we're talking about other interreligious dialogues that, we live in today that actually claim victims, people who die because of interreligious dialogue and language? When people argue on Twitter and then people take up guns and shoot because of interreligious dialogue. How does the humor and the mockery live through the century? What responsibility does it have to events that follow? How does it serve in the larger world of dialogue between religious groups? What's the difference in genre and style? When I talked about rabbinic literature, which was more veiled and funny, and when we read more direct and harsh text today, how does it play differently? When you're trying to, what is more effective? When you liken someone to ants or frogs sitting in a march, or when you're like saying this is pitiful and awful, or when you say this doesn't make any sense, or when you're telling a story about a rabbi dying and mocking it. How the difference in style and tone in the mockery and then the humor and the satire influence or make a difference in the way it works in the interreligious dialogue, and more. So we can turn off the slides now, and basically what I wanted to show today is kind of a summary of a lot of the topics that we covered in today's lectures, in the other two lectures as well. And what I tried to do is take a broader look about humor, mockery, polemics in the context of interreligious dialogues. And we took concrete examples. We looked at the way the rabbis joke in general, the way they do that as part of the interreligious dialogue. And we talked about the rabbis, but we also talked about Christian writers today. And I basically tried to paint a picture and look at questions that involve both, right? Both kinds of literature, and even I brought in a Greco-Roman writer, and basically ask about the question of humor and polemics and interreligious dialogue. And that was the topic of our conversation. And to conclude, because I promised you that I have a very good comment that someone made on one of the talks, so if you don't mind, I'm going to quote one of you who were kind enough to write in the comments. This is Alan Lavin or Lavin. I don't know how to spell to pronounce your last name, but he wrote in one of the comments that his rabbi, I think, when he needed to bring an example of Jewish humor or rabbinic humor, he used it to quote, "Talmidei chachamim merbim shalom ba'olam." The students of the sages or the sages increase the peace in the world. Now that anyone who knows anything about rabbinic literature and know how much they argue between them and how many disagreements or whatever, and reads this sentence, it's hard for us to understand whether it was meant as a real thing or as a joke. And I think you're completely right, or whoever you're quoting is completely right, that this is a very good example of humor. Yeah. They don't increase the peace in the world, right? So you're making this and you're like, oh, they increase the peace in the world, right? By the way, this is part of the world we live in that sometimes often when I text to my friends or whatever, and sometimes the tone doesn't pass, right? Or you need an emoji at the end to clarify that you were joking or that not to read it too harshly, right? We have the same thing in ancient literature as well. When someone wrote that sages increase the peace in the world, were they using humor to say that or not? I kind of choose to believe they did, but I know a lot of people read this flat out as it's meant to be read, not humoristically. So again, thank you for that comment, and I think that's a good place to stop and basically conclude that the rabbis use humor. They were funny. I love teaching them because of that. But they also use humor to talk about things that matter in the world, right? Whether this is sages in their place in the world, but also to talk about how to deal with things that made them anxious and things that made them worried, such as Christians, and vice versa. Also, when the Christians were defending their Christian faith and attacking Jews, how did they use humor or polemics or satire to do so, or mockery? Thank you, everyone, for joining me. And now some time for questions. Tamar?
Yes, thank you very much, Michal. So a few comments that came up on a similar topic. So some would say that from a modern point of view, this isn't exactly humor, but rather maybe distasteful commentary against the other. And this is different maybe than the previous session in which there was a different kind of humor. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, and when I was preparing these classes, I knew this would come up, and this is, by the way, this is one of the points that I made in the last slides about the difference in genre and style. Yes, there are differences, and because we don't have enough time to go into the different, labeling of different kinds of humor and mockery, etc. You're right. There's something that's more on the funny side and something that's more on the direct side. And you're right, some are more, I look at it as kind of a range where we have very direct attack that make fun and they're like, not funny haha, but, make fun of, as opposed to maybe funny haha. But I have to say, when I was teaching the text from last week to Christian audiences, and sometimes I stop myself in the middle and realize that sometimes when they mock Jesus for saying he'll be back after 3 days, and he's not back, and the good news, I'm quoting from last week, the good news is that Jesus did not come back, even though he said he would, and that's the real gospel, and we're all laughing, ha ha, or whatever the audiences was this for intended. It's not as funny to someone who really believes in Jesus coming back after 3 days, right? So this is always on the verge of being not tasteful, not PC, right? This is for our modern audiences. This is difficult. This is hard, and this is because it derives from the fact that we're talking about interreligious dialogue and polemics, right? They're fighting over who God's love more and how to become the best, to choose the right theology. So it does get nasty from time to time and less funny, haha, and more, but indeed, I took, the word humor or satire to be very loosely based on everything that has to do with mockery basically polemics that's done between those two groups.
All right. Now, some of the questions are from the earlier part of the lecture. So, Greek mythology is based on God's interactions with humans. So, how can the Greek philosopher mock the prophets of the Jews and the Christians for basically doing the same?
Well, I don't know if you've noticed that I've been very, very careful not to say pagan or not to say Greek, and I kept saying Greek or Roman, and I was very careful because, now we have to stop here for a second, I'll explain a little. When we're talking about the word pagan or Oved Avodah Zarah or something like that, the equivalent in Hebrew, this is the way we call, or the Christian call the other, right? So we call them pagans. No one in the ancient world called himself pagan, right? No one called himself Oved Avodah Zarah. This is not something that people called themselves, right? They had different religion in the Greco-Roman world. They had mystery religion, and they had philosophy religion, and they had imperial religion, and they had all kinds of different religions and different gods and different deities and different temples. And it's just, in rabbinic literature, we find all those, of the Avodah Zarah that are a group. Or the Christian would call them pagans, right? All this group that doesn't exist in its own. It's just the way we call them. It's kind of like when the Greek called all the others who don't speak Greek barbarian. They're just like everyone who talks we don't understand their language. It's just a nickname, by the way, a mockery, and a name that is not nice to call someone pagan, or if you call someone idol worshiper or something like that. No one would call themselves that. It's the name we called them. Now, when we get to Celsus, I don't know if you've noticed, I was very careful to use the word Greco-Roman writer. In this case, he writes in Greek, but it's part of the Greco-Roman world of theology and many, many religions, and so it's very, very complicated to address them as a group, right? So this is why. Now, back to the question at hand. When we're talking about mythology, and right, so we do have prophets and we do have gods communicating with humans, but it's complicated how it's done and what's the relationship between that and the belief that he's holding and whatever. But this specific writer, Celsus, does not believe in personal, that God cares what humans do and punish them or not done punishment and gives them instructions all the time. And his belief is a different belief of a God that doesn't communicate with his people, and it doesn't make any sense to him. And that's his belief, right? And this is what we know from his writer. By the way, it's a good question. We have that in medieval time when we have to ask question about God and its presence, and it's not an easy thing to say that God communicates with people. It's a tough bind for philosophy and theology. So it's a good question, and it was answered in different ways in the ancient world and medieval times, and I would say even modern time. But that's a good question.
Okay, I think we'll take a last question. This is regarding the first text, the letter at the beginning. Could it be that the writer of the letter was just an extremist and that normal Christians actually didn't mock Jewish laws?
Well, let's talk about extremist. We don't know anything about the provenance of the letter, like we don't know about many texts from the 2nd century, and we can only guess how prevalent was this view. We have a few of these lists that's trying to list what Jews do and Christians don't, and these lists are kind of similar. I kind of try to share that this is not a made-up list, right? It's a good list to make of Jews. Mocking Jews was a thing that people did in some writings in the 2nd century, and we have a few from different writers from that time period. And they're harsh and they're not easy to read. But also, we side by side that, we have other texts that, when Chrysostom, trashes those who go and he puts down or he says to people who go and do with the Jews that they shouldn't do it, that's Chrysostom. But his people on the ground go and fast with the Jews. So we actually have a text that tells us what Christians do. They have Christian Chrysostom, and we have Christians on the ground. It's two different Christians. So who are we talking about? Christians and Jews. Both. Things are complicated. We have people who think that Jews and Christians should be totally different and separate and not do what others. And then we have people who think differently. And that's the interesting thing, that these texts don't represent all of Christians and all of Jews. They represent a writer. and his community or whatever, the people surrounding him. And we have other texts that shows that things were much more complex than we think. And we have to think of the ancient world as kind of like a matrix of many, many different practices and beliefs and interaction between Jews and Christians, and things are complicated. And humor plays part in that.
Well, things are complicated. That seems like a nice Jewish answer to everything. Thank you very much, Michal. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we hope you join us for our next session, which will be, unfortunately, the last in this series. So thank you, Yishai and Ashraf, who are with us also, and Chagai. Good evening.
Right.